Chapter 30. On October 27th, 10 days after the first American troops stormed ashore on the Philippines, Imperial Headquarters issued this historic communiqué. The Shikishima unit of the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, at 10:45 hours on 25th of October 1944, succeeded in a surprise attack against the enemy task force, including 4 aircraft carriers, 30 nautical miles northeast of Suluan, Philippine Islands. 2 special attack planes plunged together into an enemy carrier, causing great fires and explosions, and probably sinking the warship. A 3rd plane dove into another carrier, setting huge fires. A 4th plane plunged into a cruiser, causing a tremendous explosion which sank the vessel immediately afterward. This was the thunderous beginning of the kamikazes. The first suicide mission was led by Lieutenant S.G. Yukio Seki, who flew at the head of 5 Zero fighters, each carrying a 550-pound bomb. Seki was a bomber pilot with less than 300 hours flight time. The other 4 pilots had logged no more hours in the air. Yet, of the 5, only 1 plane missed its target in the death dive. 4 Zero fighters provided escort for the 5 bomb-carrying aircraft. I discovered later that the flight leader of the escort group was my friend Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, by then a warrant officer. Nishizawa adroitly avoided interception by more than 20 prowling Hellcats, taking his 9 planes through the wild storms to reach the enemy fleet. After the dives of the 5 kamikaze planes, Nishizawa returned with his flight to his base at Mabalacat on Cebu and reported the mission as an outstanding success. Everywhere in the Navy, pilots talked about the unprecedented attack, and it had been carried out with such brilliant results, by contrast with our disastrous losses at Iwo Jima. As a fighter pilot, I was never inclined to approve of suicide missions, but now there was no denying the tremendous blow which had been struck at the American fleet off the Philippines. Even I had to acknowledge the fact that the suicide dives appeared to be our only means of striking back at the American warships. From that day on, kamikaze became a byword of our language, a term which assumed new meaning. We knew every time the kamikaze planes took off that our men were going to die. Many of them never even reached their objectives, blasted from the sky by the enemy interceptors and the incredible walls of anti-aircraft fire thrown up by the ships. But there were always those which did get through, which plummeted like avenging spirits from the sky, sometimes with wings torn off, at other times engulfed in flames. One after the other, sometimes in pairs, often as many as 6, 10, and 16, they roared off their runways for the last time, then plunged into their objectives. The kamikazes gave us tremendous new strength. Their effectiveness was obvious in the number of enemy warships and transports, once inviolate from our attacks, safe behind their withering firepower, which now resounded with the roar of flaming gasoline, exploding bombs, the shrieks of men. The kamikazes ripped aircraft carriers from stem to stem, sinking more than all our combined weapons had been able to destroy. They split open cruisers and destroyers and exacted a terrible toll. To the enemy, our men seemed to be committing suicide. They were throwing their lives away uselessly. Perhaps it will never be fully understood by Americans, or anyone in the Western world, that our men did not consider that they were throwing away their lives. On the contrary, the kamikaze pilots volunteered en masse for their one-way missions. This was not suicide. These men, young and old, were not dying in vain. Every plane which thundered into an enemy warship was a blow struck for our land. Every bomb carried by a kamikaze into the fuel tanks of a giant carrier meant that many more of the enemy killed, that many more planes which would never bomb and strafe over our soil. These men had faith. They believed in Japan, in striking a blow for Japan with their lives. It was a cheap price to pay. One man, perhaps, against the lives of hundreds or even thousands. Our country no longer had the means to base its strength on conventional tactics. We were no longer possessed of such national power. And a man, every one of these men, who surrendered his mortal soul was not dying. He passed on life to those who remained. Again, however, it was a case of too little and too late. Not even the stupendous toll reaped by the kamikazes could halt the terrible power amassed by the Americans. They were too mighty, too many, too advanced. There were too many ships and planes and guns and men. Perhaps our men who flew for the last time realized this. It is difficult to believe that many of those who flew the kamikazes did not recognize the hopelessness of Japan's position in the war. They did not flinch, they did not hesitate. They flew their bomb-laden planes and died for their country. There were other developments of more ominous significance for our people. One of the great B-29s soared over Tokyo for the first time on November 1st, 1944, flying to Japan from the new bases on Saipan. The dreaded moment for the people of the capital city was almost at hand, for it was obvious that the tremendous bomber was but a reconnaissance plane, paving the way for others to follow in the near future. The superfortress cruised leisurely high over Tokyo, and Army and Navy fighters scrambled frantically to intercept the raider. They failed to get close enough to fire a single shot. On November 5th, and again on the 7th, single B-29s from Saipan visited Japan. For the second and third times, fighter planes scrambled into the air and vainly struggled to reach the great height at which the B-29s cruised. The High Command spluttered angrily and cursed the pilots for being so clumsy and inept in the air. "One plane," they thundered. "One plane, and we can do nothing." They did not understand the difficulties of intercepting the superfortresses at that height. For one thing, our fighters did not have the rate of climb which would allow them to reach more than 30,000 feet in the few minutes available between the time the alarm was received and the time the bombers departed. Even had they reached the more than 6 miles, the pilots doubted their ability to slug it out with the B-29s, which had amazing speed. In December, the long-awaited blows came. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, and the other great cities of our country reeled beneath the terrible assault of waves of bombers. They went after the aircraft plants in particular and devastated factory after factory. Too often, the flow of new fighters died to a trickle. Spare parts became more and more difficult to find. The history of the terrible fire raids launched against Japan's greatest cities has been documented in the greatest detail. It is a story well known to the world. The superfortresses came at night, and most of the Japanese pilots sat helplessly on the ground, cursing the lack of night fighters, the lack of training for night combat. Except for a few fighter planes, which did no more than to annoy the nocturnal raiders, the enemy planes were harassed only by anti-aircraft fire. Everywhere we were losing. Everywhere we were forced to fall back, to retreat. Our air units were being slashed to ribbons, their planes falling in droves, the pilots not dying singly or by 2s or 3s, but by the dozens. By mid-January, our ability to defend the Philippines had vanished. Literally every Japanese warplane in the islands was gone, either shot out of the air by the American fighters it engaged or expended in the kamikaze attacks, which continued until no planes were left. Now we were concerned not with the islands, but with the defense of the homeland itself. We knew the B-29s, even with their terrible power to burn and destroy entire cities, were not the last word. More planes, other types of planes, would come. On January 20th, the Imperial Navy organized a new fighter wing, the last of the war, at Matsuyama on Shikoku Island. When I transferred to the new air base, I found Commander Nakajima assigned to the wing as its deputy commander. He had fled the Philippines with 50 fighter pilots to help staff the new group. This was no ordinary wing of fighters. We had the best men in Japan. Our wing commander was Captain Minoru Genda, considered one of the most brilliant naval strategists Japan has ever produced. Nakajima was the only man I knew personally. When the opportunity presented itself, I dropped into his office to talk about the men we had fought with in the past. It was he who stunned me with the news of Nishizawa's death. "He was lost," Nakajima said, "under deplorable circumstances on October 26th, the day after the first kamikaze attack against the American warships. Nishizawa volunteered for the kamikaze mission on the second day, after he had returned from his escort flight of the first 5 planes to dive into the enemy fleet. He told me that he was convinced that he would soon die." It was strange, Nakajima mused, but Nishizawa insisted that he had a premonition. He felt he would live no longer than a few days. I wouldn't let him go. A pilot of such brilliance was of more value to his country behind the controls of a fighter plane than diving into a carrier, as he begged to be permitted to do. Nakajima described how Nishizawa's fighter was armored with a 550-pound bomb and manned by NAP IAC Tomisaku Katsumata. At least Nishizawa had the benefit of knowing that his plane had fulfilled the mission he wanted to fly. Katsumata plunged directly onto the deck of an American carrier off Surigao, exploding the fuel tanks of planes waiting for takeoff, turning the carrier into a raging furnace. That same day, Nishizawa took off in an old, unarmed DC-3 transport to fly himself and several other pilots to Clark Field, where they could pick up some Zero fighters. The transport took off early on the morning of October 26th from Mabalacat. It was never heard from again. Only one thing could have happened, Nakajima reflected. His plane must have been caught by the Hellcats operating in that area. Unarmed and flying an old transport, he didn't have a chance. Most likely he went down somewhere over Cebu. I still find it hard to believe, Saburo, that such a great pilot had to die like that, helpless, unable to fight. There was nothing to say, so Nishizawa too was gone. The devil, the scourge of enemy planes at Lai and Rabaul, had gone the same way as Sasai and Ota and all the others. If anything, Nishizawa fought even harder in the Philippines, Nakajima said. He no longer bothered to count his victories in the air combat. Nishizawa was like that. Nakajima believed that he had shot down more than 100 enemy planes in the air combat. There was no question, either to Nakajima or myself, or to any man who knew and who had fought with him, that Nishizawa was Japan's greatest ace, a pilot of unparalleled skill and ability, and he had been killed flying an unarmed transport plane. The news of his death affected me strangely. I returned to my quarters and took out pen and paper. At least, I thought, I would not die without first saying to Hatsuyo what I had longed to say, what I felt she wanted also to know. I have been reassigned to combat duty, I wrote. From this day on, we shall be fighting against what appear to be overwhelming odds. Today, I heard that my very close friend, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, was killed in the Philippines. Nishizawa was the greatest pilot our country has ever known. I feel that if he has met his end, then I, handicapped by the loss of an eye, am certain to follow him soon. Perhaps this letter will be the last one I shall ever write to you. It is impossible to tell, Hatsuyo, but I cannot wait any longer to tell you what I have wanted to say for so long. The last time we spoke, you told me I did not understand a woman's heart. You were wrong, Hatsuyo, so very wrong. Do you recall our days as children together? Those were wonderful times, filled with fun and laughter. You and I lived as sister and brother, and even then our fondness for each other was strong. What I have long wished to tell you, Hatsuyo, was that in my heart, you have been the dearest person on this earth to me. I know now that I have looked upon you as my only love. Perhaps it is wrong to say so. Perhaps it is not the way I would like it to be said. But I believe you were always there in my heart. I did not know it then, as I have known it for these last months. I have long loved you, Hatsuyo, and loved you deeply. There has been no outward sign from me to you, although this has been the hardest thing in my life. To keep away from you the way I really felt. I love you now. I have waited so long to tell you these words. The war has created a great barrier between us. I realize that my feelings have never been shown, that this love I have for you has been throttled and kept inside. We are, after all, cousins. Perhaps it is best for both of us that marriage lies beyond our grasp. But now, I have said what was necessary. I pray for only one thing, my love. May you live long, and may happiness be yours forever. The next morning our combat training began in earnest. The pilots shouted uproariously when they watched the dozens of gleaming new fighters landing on the field. The Shiden, the airplane which I had test-flown not too long ago. The men went wild with joy as they took the fighters off the ground. Speed, 4 cannon, armor plate, tremendous climb, diving speed, maneuverability. It was all there, all wrapped up in one fighter plane, This was no longer the Zero, outclassed in almost every respect by the Hellcat. The pilots couldn't wait to return to the air. They wanted to know every trick their planes had, everything they could do. Their morale soared to new heights. "Bring on the Hellcats!" they shouted. They were out for blood again. The majority of the flyers in the new wing were veterans of many battles. There were aces among their ranks. We were the elite of all the fighter units in the Imperial Navy, which was why we had been supplied the new planes. Despite the compelling need for volunteers in the kamikaze units, these men together were the strongest air weapon Japan had produced, and Commander Nakajima rejected all applications for transfer to the kamikaze operations. More than 10 days had passed without a reply to my letter to Hatsuyo. I could not understand why she failed to answer me. There was nothing I could do. I could not afford to allow sentiment to interfere with my duties, especially now. On the 12th day after I had sent the letter, I was giving a lecture to new pilots on dogfighting techniques. When the class was over, an orderly approached to inform me that I had 2 visitors waiting to see me. I left at once for the guest room. I found Hatsuyo and her mother awaiting me. As soon as I entered the room, Hatsuyo rose from her chair. "I have come, Saburo," she said quietly. "I have come here to become your wife." I stood frozen to the floor, struck dumb. "If you are prepared to die, Saburo, then it is the same with me. If we are to be given only days or weeks, then we shall have them together. That is God's will for us." "Hatsuyo," I cried. It was impossible. It couldn't be true. It was all too wonderful to happen to me. My aunt spoke. "Saburo, there is no reason why you and Hatsuyo should not be wed. The fact that you are cousins should not stand between you. You are both sound mentally and physically. It is my daughter's wish, and mine, that this marriage shall come to pass." I was delirious with joy. But before we could proceed further with any wedding plans, there was the matter of writing my mother and asking for her approval, as the eldest of my family. Her letter offered her blessings, but contained the unhappy news that she would be unable to attend the ceremony. Kyushu's rail facilities had been torn into wreckage, and no passengers were being carried. She requested my aunt to attend to all necessary details. When I first arrived at Matsuyama, the president of a large aircraft factory in the city had offered me a spacious upstairs room in his large home. He told me that he had followed my actions in combat from the time I shot down my very first plane in China, and that he wished me to live with his family. I declined the offer, not because I did not wish to accept his generosity, but for another reason entirely. I felt it would be unfair for me to enjoy the comforts of a large home while the men with whom I flew remained in shabby barracks. Now, however, I needed a place to live for Hatsuyo and myself. Rather embarrassed, I informed Commander Nakajima of my marriage plans. He broke into a wide smile and told me to stand exactly where I was, not to move an inch. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the company president direct. I was to move in as soon as the marriage took place, he said, then hung up. Nakajima had known of the generous offer and refused to entertain any objections. Hatsuyo and I were married the evening of February 11th, 1945, on our country's Foundation Day. It was a modest ceremony, attended only by my aunt and the company president's family. The plans for the wing pilots to attend were changed at the last moment when an air raid alert occurred early in the evening. The other men remained by their planes, ready to scramble, while the marriage took place. We had not anticipated that our wedding music would be the spine-shivering shriek of hundreds of air raid sirens. After the ceremony, Hatsuyo and I walked together through the blackout to a Shinto shrine. There we knelt and reported to God of our marriage. A honeymoon, of course, was out of the question under the circumstances. On the following Sunday, we invited the 50 pilots of the wing to a reception. They had laughed loudly at my report of the Siren's March, the night of the ceremony. The reception more than made up for the lack of festivities on our wedding night. Many of the pilots brought with them their own instruments, guitars, and accordions, and belatedly played for us a joyous wedding march. I was the happiest man in the world. The pilots exclaimed over and over again about the beauty of my bride. It was a wonderful, wonderful night. My aunt had a surprise for all of us. She had scoured the remote provinces and somehow managed to purchase additional food for the occasion. The 50 men fell to their meals with gusto. The party continued late into the night. All the men gathered in a large group and sang song after song for us. Hatsuyo led the chorus with the piano, and the men with instruments gathered around her to form an impromptu orchestra. Those were the happiest hours I had ever known. I was drunk with happiness. All that had happened before now seemed unimportant. It was trifling compared to the wondrous joy and elation which swept through me now. I could not take my eyes off Hatsuyo. She was a dream come true, a princess of fairy tales, radiant, beautiful. She was my wife. Chapter 31. In March of 1945, for the first and only time in its history, the Japanese Navy departed from its rule of no precedence in announcing a special citation to 2 naval fighter pilots. Only the critical military situation could have influenced our imperial staff to perform such an act. The citations awarded to NAP IC Shoichi Sugita and to me, both of us part of the Matsuyama wing, were intended to bolster the flagging morale of many pilots. Sugita, 24 years old, was a brilliant flyer. Most of his combat activity took place at Truk and in the Philippines, during which he claimed a total of 120 air kills as of January 20th, when he returned to Japan. This figure, however, appears considerably to exceed the actual number of his air victories, which I personally believe totaled about 80 planes. Sugita admitted to me that many of the victories were questionable and had not been confirmed, since battle circumstances made it impossible to provide an accurate check. Most of the dogfights occurred when Sugita fought defensively against superior numbers, and when he was unable to take the time to watch a plane actually crash, burn completely in the air, disintegrate, or be abandoned by its pilot. The fact that we did not carry gun cameras was a handicap to the man who lacked actual proof that his target was destroyed. When a nation is winning its war, every step is taken to double-check all air fighting claims, as we did during our easy conquests in Moresby Alley. But when the situation has deteriorated into a series of defensive battles against a superior enemy, accuracy invariably suffers. No one, however, could dispute Sugita's brilliance in the air. After watching him in combat, I was so impressed that I felt he could be regarded as the equal of no less an ace than Nishizawa. Sugita demonstrated his superb skill in spectacular fashion on March 19th, when the Matsuyama wing intercepted enemy carrier fighters during an attack in force against the Great Kura naval base. Prior to this air assault, Japan proper had been raided several times by carrier planes, and with virtually no opposition. Today it was different, although the American pilots thought otherwise. The radio men at Matsuyama listened in to the conversations of the enemy pilots as they appeared from the south. One would have thought they were thousands of miles from imminent combat, for they discussed openly their formations and attack altitudes. All available fighters at Matsuyama, 40 planes, took off at once. The Shidens, about to receive their baptism of fire with our wing, cruised in wide circles just above the height maintained by the enemy formations. 60 pilots, myself included, remained on the ground because of a shortage of operational planes. I had an excellent view from the control tower, from which I trained my binoculars on the planes. The battle exploded the moment the Hellcats came within range. 2 flights of Shidens screamed down from their vantage point, 1,500 feet above the Grummans. Sugita plummeted like a stone. Coming out of his dive, he rolled in against a Hellcat and snapped out a burst. The 4-cannon proved their effectiveness in dramatic fashion. Flames burst out from the fighter's engine as it careened wildly through the air, out of control. Sugita rolled away and came out directly behind a second Hellcat, sending his cannon shells into the fuselage and cockpit. The Grumman skidded crazily and plummeted for the ocean. A third fighter raced in against the Shiden. Sugita gave him no chance. His fighter soared upwards, hung on a wing, then came around in a beautiful diving turn. The Hellcat fell apart in the air. Sugita's fighter flashed away, heading for the main dogfight. It was a spectacular battle. Every man on the ground cheered and shouted as one. Hellcat after the other went down. This time it was different. This time, the Hellcats fought for their lives. Obviously the appearance of the Shiden fighters, which were much faster than the Hellcats, which possessed greater climbing speed and firepower, and which were manned by some of the best pilots in Japan, took the enemy flyers completely by surprise. An hour later, a jubilant Sugita returned to the field, singing the praises of his new plane. He claimed 4 fighters definitely shot down, kills confirmed by the other pilots, as well as 3 probables. Sugita couldn't stop talking about the Shiden. Only his lack of ammunition, he said, prevented him from downing more planes. The Matsuyama wing provided the only spark of hope for the entire day. Nowhere else over Japan could our pilots claim a victory. Indeed, the Hellcats had run wild over all other opposition, and our victories appeared to be the only losses suffered by the Americans. Later, we received copies of an American report of the air battle, which registered considerable surprise at the high performance of the Shiden fighter. The American pilots were shocked at the new airplane's ability to withstand tremendous damage from the heavy machine guns of the Hellcats. Within a month, however, disaster struck our wing. The greatest pilot still living in Japan, Soichi Sugita, was killed. The Matsuyama wing had transferred to Kanoya in southern Kyushu to oppose the American planes supporting the invasion of Okinawa. On April 17th, without any warning, mass formations of enemy fighter planes screamed down on our field. We had only a glimpse of them at about 12,000 feet as they thundered down. We were caught flat-footed. Apparently the enemy planes, both Corsairs and Hellcats, had flown from aircraft carriers in Okinawa waters. We had no radar at Kanoya, and the fighters were already diving when the alarms clamored. On the field, the battle command flag, "Go out and fight," fluttered in the wind over the command post. Several pilots ran for their planes, but Captain Gender shouted to us to get off the field and into the shelters. It was obviously too late to attempt a takeoff. His orders went unheard by Sugita, Shoji Matsumara, and another pilot. All 3 men had seen the enemy fighters before the alarm sounded and had run for their own planes. Even as the Corsairs and Hellcats screamed low over the field, Sugita and his wingman, with Matsumara directly behind, were taxiing into takeoff position. 2 enemy fighters screamed down from the right and to the rear. Sugita's wingman went first. The Shiden's wheels were barely off the ground when a Corsair fired a long burst into the fighter. The Shiden reeled wildly under the impact of the bullets of 6 heavy machine guns, tumbled wing over wing through the air, and struck the ground with a tremendous blast. Moments later, another fighter streaked in. Tracers spit through the air. I stared in horror as the bullets hurled dirt upwards as they moved across the runway and poured into Sugita's taxiing fighter. Sugita never even had a chance to take evasive action with his plane still on the ground. In a moment, the tracers had found the Shiden's fuel tanks, and the fighter exploded into a roaring ball of fire. Flame and smoke billowed behind the still-moving plane. There was no movement within the cockpit. I could not believe my eyes. The greatest pilot in Japan, an ace more than 14 times over, was dead before my eyes. The destruction of Sugita's plane saved Matsumara's life. The thick clouds of smoke which trailed the burning fighter enveloped Matsumara's plane, shielding him from the enemy fighters. Today, Shoji Matsumara is an F-86 Saba jet fighter pilot in the new Japan Air Force. He finished his war flying with the destruction of 6 Hellcats and Corsairs during the final days of combat. Those were terrible days. The great aces of Japan, their numbers already diminished by American guns, fell one after the other. 2 months after Sugita went to his death, Kinsuke Muto, the man who had fought with me at Iwo Jima, was gone. Muto scored at least 35 victories in the air, indicative of his superb flying ability and fearless actions in combat, were the 4 B-29s officially credited to him. Muto had flown brilliantly in the spring of 1945, when he was based at Yokosuka. On February 26th, he completed a sensational day in the air by attacking in an obsolete 012 Corsair carrier fighters strafing Tokyo. Muto took off from the fighter base at Atsugi and lost no time in plunging into the enemy formation. The startled pilots scattered before the unexpected attack of a single Zero, and 2 Corsairs tumbled to earth, wrapped in flames, before the American flyers could turn against Muto's plane. In a savage, incredible dogfight which ran from Atsugi to over Yokosuka, Muto confounded the enemy pilots with brilliant aerobatics. Despite their frantic efforts, the Corsairs failed to keep Muto in their sights long enough to send the Zero down. By constantly attacking, almost seeming to ram during his wild flying, Muto kept the Corsairs off his own neck while he shot down 2 more of the enemy. Finally, out of ammunition, he dove away from the fight. 4 months later, he was dead. He transferred to Okinawa in June, still flying the old Zero fighter. He was last seen attacking a Liberator bomber near Yakushima. As our other pilots reported the battle, Muto closed in to point-blank range, pouring a stream of fire into the 4-engined bomber. He never saw the Mustang, which dove with tremendous speed against him, firing a long burst which tore the right wing off his plane. We had hardly recovered from the shock of Muto's loss when the death of another of our greatest aces stunned all pilots. Lieutenant S.G. Naoshi Kano, of the Kanoya wing, met his end near Yakushima in a fighter wrapped from nose to tail in flames. Kano was famous for his unprecedented successes against the B-17s in the South Pacific, and had no less than a dozen fortresses among his 52 confirmed air victories. He was the first pilot to perfect the rolling and diving head-on attack against the fortresses, the same fearing pass later discovered by the Luftwaffe to be the most effective against the powerful B-17. So now, to the list of Sasai, Ota, Nishizawa, and others were added more of our greatest: Kano, Muto, and Sugita. Now, I, who had been denied permission to fly combat missions while at Matsuyama, was the surviving ace who led all other pilots. My demands for permission to fly the Shidens in combat were denied repeatedly by Captain Genda, who finally ordered me and Hatsuyo back to Yokosuka. In April, chafing at my orders to stay out of the air, I returned to my former base. Chapter 32. Our return to Yokosuka involved a wearying, sleepless journey of 40 hours by train. We stopped perhaps 24 times to stand on the tracks outside different cities, which even at that moment were receiving terrible punishment by enemy fighters and bombers. The strain of the uncomfortable ride was telling on Hatsuyo, who was visibly fatigued from the halting progress of the train. She never complained, but always smiled at my worried glances, and assured me in a tired whisper that she would be all right. We were appalled at the ruins and charred wreckage which met our eyes as we passed through the different cities along the route. Vast areas stretched away from each station, blackened and seared by the terrible firebombs sown by the B-29s. Each of these cities was a wasteland of ash. The wind picked up fine soot and dust and filled the air with its choking substance. Every time we left a city, we breathed a sigh of relief, only to encounter almost exactly the same garish scene before our eyes at the next station. Our country was being pounded into wreckage, and it was obvious to me as a pilot that we could do little to prevent the appalling destruction from increasing. To our surprise, the big naval city of Yokosuka was intact. Strangely, the Americans spared it, while the B-29s burned and leveled more than 140 other provincial cities, many of far less strategic value than this naval bastion. Perhaps the fact that Yokosuka harbored none of the huge battleships or aircraft carriers contributed to its immunity from the enemy's bombs. I saw only small motorboats churning across the big port, maneuvering wildly, undergoing special training. The crews were preparing themselves for the final day when our soil would be invaded. These were the counterparts of the kamikaze planes. Each speedboat was crammed full with high explosives, and its crew would race in against enemy transports to destroy themselves with the enemy. Again, there was a price to be paid. But how many men on an American transport or warship could be killed by 2 or 3 Japanese smashing their boat against the sides of an enemy vessel? The Navy provided us with a small 3-room dependent house near the Opama airfield in northern Yokosuka. Our life was far from easy, and Hatsuyo did her best to transform our meager supplies of food into something resembling meals. The huge storage warehouses at Yokosuka were virtually empty, stripped of all their goods by the military. The meals served to officers and enlisted men were no longer different. They were equally poor and ill-tasting. We lived at the barest level of subsistence. All post-exchange and dependent purchase centers had long ago been boarded up for lack of supplies. Most of the stores in the city proper had been closed for months. Even though it had escaped the bombing which had smashed other cities, Yokosuka was dreary and almost lifeless. The few people who trudged the streets were hungry and destitute. And still the B-29s came in ever greater numbers and carrying more and more bombs. The raids we had thought to be the ultimate in destruction were eclipsed less than 24 hours later in assaults which beg a description. Literally, millions of firebombs cascaded down from the skies, causing conflagrations the like of which the Earth had never seen before. All Japan was shocked by a raid on Tokyo, which came on the night of March 10th. More than 19 square miles of the city lay gutted the morning after. A fantastic, rotting wasteland. There were reports that as many as 130,000 people had died during the flaming night. Originally, the army had been charged with the responsibility of intercepting the great bombers. They never achieved even a fleeting moment of success in this task. After a series of costly and futile attempts to stem the tide of superfortresses, the army licked its wounds and abandoned all attempts at interception. They left the sky to the B-29s, and all army planes were withdrawn from active service. Mechanics swarmed over the fighters and bombers, working to bring them into the best possible condition, preparing them for the day of reckoning when the Americans would invade. Now the responsibility for defending the homeland lay entirely in the hands of the Navy. Every day our fighters went up to slash at the B-29s, and every day we achieved spectacularly little success. Our men were doing their best, but it was not enough against the superfortress. From Atsugi, near Yokosuka, Raiden fighters took off on interception flights against the B-29s that resulted in daily wild scrambles. For a short period of time, the fighters broke the B-29's myth of invincibility, and the Raiden's 4 cannon and flashing speed raised our hopes by blowing several B-29s from the sky. The enemy's answer was to send swarms of Mustangs over Japan during the daylight raids. The swift enemy fighters tore savagely at our planes and slaughtered them. Where the Raiden shone against the B-29, it was helpless before the swifter, more maneuverable Mustang. Almost every day our new fighters plunged burning from the sky, their wings torn off, their pilots dead. Out of this terrible massacre there emerged but one shining pilot, a man of superb flying ability, Lieutenant J.G. Teimei Akamatsu, who was as different from other pilots as night from day. He was the only Japanese naval pilot I ever knew who had successfully defied almost every regulation in the books. He was the typical swashbuckling hero of fiction, powerfully built, noisy, and always happy. Akamatsu had joined the Navy nearly 10 years before my own enlistment, but he failed to achieve the rapid promotions which his fellow pilots coveted. Indeed, he was even broken in rank on several occasions and threatened with dishonorable discharge. He was incorrigible, but he was a genius in the air, and the Navy was loath to lose a man of his spectacular ability. Akamatsu stunned his superior officers by his conduct. Instead of attending pilot briefings and waiting on the flight line like the other men, he had his own warning system hooked up in a brothel. He often came racing to the airbase in an old car, driving like a demon with one hand, drinking from a bottle held in the other. The sirens were screaming a warning as he bolted from the car to his fighter plane, already warmed up by the mechanics. He took off the moment the cockpit canopy was closed. He was equally as wild in the air as he was on the ground, and was the only pilot who ever successfully engaged both Mustangs and Hellcats in dogfights and emerged the victor. Akamatsu shot down no less than 10 of these excellent enemy planes while flying the Raiden, a feat most other pilots considered to be impossible. Akamatsu was fortunate in that at least 8 of these kills were verified by other flyers. To this day, no man knows how many enemy planes Akamatsu shot down in combat. He fought continuously for more than 6 years, cutting his teeth in China, where he bagged several enemy fighters. Then he went on to fight in almost every area of the Pacific, often returning with his plane shot to ribbons, grinning and shouting loudly. Akamatsu himself does not know his total number of victories. When drunk, He would pound his fist on the table and bellow that he had blown at least 350 Allied planes out of the air. He never boasted when he was sober. Other pilots who had fought with him and managed to survive through the war corrected this figure down to about 50 air kills. I often saw Akamatsu landing at Opama when he failed to reach Atsugi because of fuel shortages caused by the wild air melees. It was heartening to everyone on the field to see him climbing out of his fighter, thumbing his nose at the bullet holes, always grinning. He would shout to me and hold up his hand with several fingers upraised, denoting the number of planes he had shot down that day. More than once, Akamatsu took off in a flight of 5 to 8 fighters and was the only man in the group to survive the battles. Mustangs were his favorite prey, and he had a healthy respect for the American fighter. He cursed the officers who sent up green pilots in the Raiden. They could barely fly the airplane, let alone fight with it. Akamatsu survived the war. Today, he runs a small restaurant in Kochi, his hometown in Shikoku Island. The Opama Air Base was mainly a testing field where pilots ran new fighters through their flight checks. I was not given the opportunity to fight for a long time, since the base commander felt that my long experience would be invaluable in testing our new planes. I realized that more combat, however, was only a matter of time. Every man who could fly, every plane which could stagger into the air, would be thrown against the invading fleet. In June, I was ordered to report to Nagoya to test a new fighter plane, the Reppu. There had been rumors about the new aircraft which indicated that the Reppu was the greatest plane which had ever flown. I was anxious to get my hands on the ship to see if the rumors had some substance. Such a fighter would be a blessing to us. All the rumors were true. The Reppu was a sensational airplane, the fastest I had ever flown. It took my breath away with its tremendous speed, and its rate of climb was astounding. With a powerful engine, a 4-bladed propeller, and new superchargers, the Reppu ran away from everything in the air, Japanese or American. It could fly circles in a climb around either the Hellcat or the Mustang, and the engineers told me it would fight at better than 40,000 feet. Unhappily, for us, the Mitsubishi factories, which were to produce the Reppu, were blasted into wreckage before production could get underway. Only 7 planes were produced. The one existing model, flown by the enemy after the war, astounded the American pilots with its flashing performance. Before I left for Nagoya, Hatsuyo had made me promise to purchase for her a small dagger. The city was famous for its outstanding swords and daggers, and my wife insisted upon a blade from the craftsman of that city. Upon my return, Hatsuyo silently inspected the gleaming length of steel, cautiously touching the blade. "Saburo, it is not sharp enough." She looked at me. "Tomorrow, at Opama, will you hone the steel to a fine edge?" Her serious expression startled me. "What on earth did you want a dagger for anyway?" I asked. She took my hands in hers and looked directly into my eyes. "You are my life, Saburo," she said quietly. "All that matters in this world is you. There is only one thing for me to do if you are killed." She said no more, and I pressed the matter no further. The next day I sharpened the blade on an oil stone until the edge was razor sharp. That night, Hatsuyo tested the steel by slicing effortlessly through soft tissue paper. "It is good now," she commented, then slipped the dagger beneath her kimono sash. We never discussed the subject again. After our departure from Matsuyama, Hatsuyo never touched a piano. I knew that she wanted to play again. She had a wonderful feeling for music, and could have passed the hours much more easily with a piano to occupy her during the long days. She declined my offer to borrow the instrument we had at the officers' mess. So long as we were all fighting so hard, she said, it was not right for her to enjoy the pleasure of music by herself. I could appreciate her attitude. All Japan suffered bitterness, which rose even above the pain and horror of the bombings. The nation was being torn asunder. Our cities lay prostrate and flaming, as if trampled by a gigantic foot. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that the end was near, that soon the fighting would be transferred to our soil. There was no possibility of surrender. We would fight to the last man. On August 6th, the reports of a vast and terrible explosion in Hiroshima later confirmed as an atomic bomb, stunned the pilots at Opama. The idea that a single plane could inflict so much damage was staggering and too great to absorb all at once. Then came the hammer blow of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which followed almost immediately. This was more personal and more real, and far more devastating in its implications. 3 in the afternoon on August 13th, all officers at the Opama base were hurriedly summoned to a secret meeting in the commandant's office. Our commanding officer was pale and visibly shaken. He could hardly stand and supported his weight against his desk. He spoke weakly, in a faltering voice. "What I am about to tell you is of the utmost importance," he began, "and must be regarded as absolutely top secret. I rely upon your integrity as officers of the Imperial Navy to keep this information strictly to yourselves. Japan," here his voice choked, "has decided to accept the enemy's terms. We will abide by the Potsdam Declaration." He stared at us with vacant eyes. "The surrender orders may be announced at any moment. I want all officers to cooperate with me to the fullest. Order must be maintained at this base. There may be hotheads who will refuse to accept the decision to surrender. We cannot afford to have our men violate whatever conditions our country accepts. Remember, and never forget it, that His Majesty's orders come before anything else." A bomb could have exploded among us, and not a man would have flinched. We were rooted to the floor, unbelieving. We had known that the end would come, but we had not anticipated this. The men walked slowly from the room, dazed, many staring dully ahead of them or at the floor. Some of the officers were crying, others cursing. I myself was incapable of thought or speech. I walked in a fog, crossing the field without looking to either side. For some reason, I wanted to be near my plane, and I leaned weakly against the Zero. A close friend of mine, Ensign Jiro Kawachi, walked up to me. For several minutes we stood next to each other, mute, unable to talk. It was over. We had lost. Japan was about to surrender. "Sakai," I looked up. "Saburo, it is just about the end now," Kawachi spoke. "We have very little time left. Let us make one more flight together. One last flight." He kicked the ground idly with his foot. "We just can't quit like this," he protested. "We have to draw blood once more." I nodded. He was right. We told the maintenance men to move our 2 Zeros out to the runway to prepare them for flight. We knew that the superfortresses would bomb tonight. The weather forecast appeared promising, and there were so many bombers overhead every evening that B-29s could be intercepted almost anywhere. For a long time, they had flown over Opama without opposition, using the field for a landmark. They would not expect fighters. Kawachi and I kept our plans strictly to ourselves, not even telling the other pilots. After we inspected our fighters, we walked to the tower and sat down to wait. Several hours passed without a word between us. We were lost in our thoughts, the memories of the long years from China onward. The afternoon passed, and we remained seated, almost invisible in the darkness. Shortly before midnight, the tower radio spluttered. "Alert! Alert! A B-29 formation is now approaching the Yokosuka, Tokyo area." We jumped to our feet and ran across the field to our planes. The airbase lay in blackness, not a light showing. There was just enough light from the stars to enable us to make our way. When we reached the Zeros, we discovered we were not the only pilots determined to go up for a last mission. At least 8 other fighters were lined up at the edge of the runway, fueled and armed. I was afraid that with only one eye, I would not be able to see properly at night in the air, and I asked Kawachi to lead me off the ground. We took off at once, without any further conversation. At any moment, we knew, the commandant might learn of our plans and order the planes held on the ground. The moment we were airborne, I swung in close to Kawachi's fighter and took up a position off his wing. 8 other Zeros were in the air with us, forming into 2 flights behind our planes. We climbed steadily, then circled at 10,000 feet over Tokyo Bay. Kawachi's fighter banked abruptly and pulled away to the east. I flew with him, the 2 flights close behind. For a few moments, I failed to see any other planes in the air. Then Kawachi's cannon started firing. and I made out the big bomber flying northward. I had him now, clear in my sights. I pulled up almost alongside Kawachi's plane and opened fire. We each had 4 cannon now, and we would need every weapon against the tremendous airplane. I had never seen anything so huge. As I swung around after completing my firing pass, I saw the 8 other fighters storming the superfortress. They appeared like tiny gnats milling around a tremendous bull. How could we hope to shoot down an airplane of such incredible size? I came in again, climbing and sending my fire into the B-29's underside. The counterfire was terrible. Tracers spilled into the air from the multiple turrets on the B-29, and I felt the Zero shudder several times as the enemy gunners found their mark. We ignored the bomber guns and kept pressing home the attack. The superfortress turned and headed south. Apparently, we had damaged the big plane, and now he was running for home. I clung to Kawachi and slammed the engine on overboost. The other 8 fighters were already lost far behind us, and it was doubtful that we could keep up with the bomber. It possessed remarkable speed and was, in fact, faster than the Zeros I had flown at Leh. Kawachi, however, had no intention of losing the big plane in the dark. He cut inside the B-29's wide turn and led me down in a shallow diving attack. This time we had a clear shot, and both Kawachi and I kept the triggers down, watching the tracers and shells ripping into the glass along the bomber's nose. We had him. Suddenly, the superfortress's speed fell off, and the pilot dropped the airplane down for a long dive. We came around in a tight turn, firing steadily in short bursts, pouring the cannon shells into the crippled plane. The great bomber descended quickly. I saw no fire or smoke. There was no visible damage, but the airplane continued to lose altitude steadily, dropping toward the ocean. We kept after the fleeing plane. Oshima Island suddenly loomed out of the darkness. We were 50 miles south of Yokosuka. We pulled out of our dives and climbed to 1,500 feet. A volcano on the island reared 1,000 feet above the water, and we dared not risk a collision in the blackness. I could make out the bomber faintly as it dropped. Presently, it ditched with a splash of white foam in the ocean, several miles off Oshima's northern coastline. In less than a minute, the B-29 disappeared beneath the water. Back at the airfield, we learned that at least 3 cities had been gutted during the night. The fires were still burning fiercely, unchecked, sweeping before the wind. The war was to end less than 12 hours later. I shook my head in dismay. The commandant was visibly angry over our flight, but he spared us his wrath. "I suppose I can't blame you," he said, "but we cannot have any repetition of what occurred tonight. From this moment on, all planes are grounded." He told me that Atsugi was the scene of wild riots, that a near rebellion had occurred on the field. That was the Raiden fighter base, where Akamatsu and other pilots were stationed, men who could not accept the idea of a surrender, who tried to get their planes into the air. They lost their heads and defied the officers, swearing that they would refuse to accept surrender, that they would fight until their last breath. Reinforcements were moved in. Not until several days after the surrender was a semblance of order restored. The destruction of the enemy bomber was kept secret for many years, and no record was made of our flight that night. And of course, no pilot claimed credit for the destruction of the B-29. This is my first disclosure of that battle. We felt no exultation at shooting down the Tremengus bomber. Nothing mattered except that we were surrendering our nation, our people, our homes to the enemy. I slept fitfully on a mess hall table until daybreak. The airbase was pandemonium itself. Many of the pilots were blind drunk, shouting and cursing wildly. Other men appeared dazed, as if they were in shock, when the historic dawn of August 15, 1945, arrived. The war was over. It was done. In every office, high-ranking officers burned documents and files. Men walked around in a stupor or sat on floors or the ground outside. Exactly at noon, we heard the Emperor personally read the surrender orders to our armed forces, wherever they happened to be. The 2,000 men at Opama stood rigidly at attention on the field. Most of us had never before heard the Emperor's voice. Many of the men were crying unashamedly. Suddenly I remembered. I had not been home last night. Hatsuyo. What would she think? If she hears the Emperor's broadcast, she will think I was killed and... I listened no more but ran from the room. There were no cars. I grabbed a bicycle and pedaled frantically toward my small home. I was there in a few minutes. I leaped off the bicycle even before it stopped moving. I flung open the door, shouting for her. Hatsuyo ran from her room and flung herself into my arms, sobbing. For several minutes, we clung fiercely to one another, unable to speak. Finally, she lifted her head. Are you all right, Saburo? She whispered. I nodded. Oh, my sweet, she cried. I wept like a child when I heard. It is really over, isn't it? The fighting, all the bombing, it is all done? I shook my head slowly in assent. I don't care about anything, Saburo, I don't care. You have won all your battles, my darling, even if we have lost. A light dawned in her eyes as she looked at me. You will never have to fight again, she whispered. It is all over now. Never again. She drew back suddenly and withdrew the dagger from beneath her sash. I will never need it again, she cried, flinging the shining steel to the floor. The dagger clattered across the room and came to a stop in the corner,